Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast, and welcome to 2023, unless we've already put out an episode this year and I haven't clocked it. And in fact, I'm saying New Year, an episode late, which is just embarrassing for everybody because we're recording this on the 11th of January, which is getting on the sort of, is it too late to say it side anyway? But nonetheless, I am joined today by Dr. Phil Price, our resident clever man. And Johnny is at home as he's had some children-related shenanigans to contend with, so hasn't made it in. But today we are going to cover the big question. The question is probably very popular and pertinent within the space of hybrid training at the moment, and that is, can you build muscle whilst getting fitter? Phil, initial thoughts? Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. Can you repeat the question? Malcolm in the middle, theme tune plays.
No, absolutely. I absolutely think you can build muscle while developing an endurance base.
Okay, excellent. And that's why everybody should stick around. So before we do that, let's do the usual requests, rate and review the show. I'll be a little bit more sincere here, because it's really valuable for us and is a really good metric for us to track. So if you do enjoy the podcast, it'd be fantastic if you can go onto Spotify and just rate us 5 stars. If you listen to us on Apple, go and rate us 5 stars and then write just a short review. It can just be, love the podcast, cheers, Gary. Or even less. It can just be a thumbs up if you want it to be, but it really does help the show continue to grow. We've got a great calendar of guests this year, and the more show growth that comes, the better guests we will have access to. So if you are bought in like we are, then it will take 15 to 20 seconds of your time, and we will massively appreciate it. If you send us a message saying you've done it, we will say thank you over the internet. So just please bear that in mind. Alongside that, if you are interested in the subject matter of today and previous podcast episodes, then please do join Omnia Performance Premium, and you can use the code ATHLETE25 for 25% off your subscription for life. For life. Madness, as there are lectures, seminars, Q&As, research databases, chat rooms in there that you can access, which is the only global resource for hybrid training related, scientific, considered education. So get involved or don't get involved if you're feeling inadequately educated on hybrid training. Isn't that right, Phil?
Absolutely get involved. Don't give anyone a choice. Just come join the party.
Look at the salesman that's coming out in Phil. Fantastic.
You've developed this in me, I think.
I have. Forget the researcher. This is we're reinventing the wheel here. This is wonderful to see. So let's kick things off, as it's a big question. I think it's probably fair to say that out with the realm of CrossFit, functional fitness, the most popular corner of hybrid training online, and in terms of bums on seats, relatively speaking, metaphorically speaking rather, is those that want to be in shape and get better at running. And with that comes some considerations. We've covered them recently with James Blanchard on his considerations and his experience and how bodybuilding and running can sort of intertwine. But beyond that, I think there's definitely some things that we can focus from a scientific point of view. And that's where we're going to break things down today, give you some things to consider, things that you should potentially ignore, things that you should maybe bear in mind that you haven't previously. And ultimately, what does the science say? How does the interference effect make a difference here? Should we focus on it? Should we not focus on it? And how can you ultimately set yourself up for success? So Phil, from the off, what are the principal considerations for people to bear in mind when it comes to hypertrophy training and fitness, when it comes to running specifically
running? Okay, that's quite that's a nice specific one to start off with. So first of all, I think we should probably give a bit of an overview of some molecular pathways, just because I think we hear these terms like mTOR and AMPK, and people kind of have a rough idea what they are, but wonder why they might interfere with each other. I say interfere with the inverted commas because that's what the term has been used in the literature. But let's keep it nice and simple. You've got the mTOR pathway, which gets activated like a list of proteins that end up getting activated, which leads to and encourages protein synthesis. And the consumption of protein, resistance training, or any type of training really which creates some kind of, or requires like muscular force, the body responds by that to try and activate this molecular pathway, which leads to protein synthesis. You've also got the AMPK pathway. So when that gets activated, it's usually during endurance training, because the body recognizes the fact that ATP has been broken down. These phosphates are sort of being kicked off. So you get this increase in ADP and AMP. So that's diphosphate, monophosphate. Pretty much goes from like a triple phosphate molecule down to 2, down to 1. The body recognizes that, so it activates this pathway because it wants to sort of regenerate ATP. So then ATP can be used again for energy. And the idea behind this, that there might be some kind of interference effect, is that, say we've got a muscle that's of a particular size. If it's any bigger, the body will have to increase the amount of ATP it needs more energy to work that bigger muscle. So the body wants to remain quite efficient. It wants to keep the body or the muscles to a certain size, because that means if it's any bigger, it has to create more energy. It doesn't really want to do that. So it's kind of like a regulatory thing. So that's where you might get this idea of an interference effect, because it's trying to regulate the mTOR pathway. It's trying to regulate protein synthesis, so the body doesn't get too big. It's known as a molecular break. So obviously you've got two different types of training, which encourages these molecular pathways to become active, but they're active for certain amounts of time. So if you do a really heavy, intense bodybuilding type session, probably going to spark or get an increase in mTOR, and it can remain elevated for around 18 hours after it. Now, this depends on the intensity, the volume that a load of different training variables for that session. AMPK only gets activated and can return to baseline up to 3 hours post the session. If you're running, you need AMPK pathway to be active, but once you stop, you're not requiring that additional energy. So it kind of goes down to baseline quite quickly. So even if there is like conflicting or regulating there, we can do things to try and avoid these activations of these pathways to happen at the same time. So hopefully by doing that, we can then maximize the recovery and increase in mTOR pathway, so we can maximize the amount of hypertrophy that we get by not allowing the running in this example to try and blunt it.
So essentially, I'm just thinking of key takeaways that we can focus on here before you sort of round things up there, which is essentially to develop your disciplines as a hybrid athlete at a beginner or intermediate level. You should be considering about the order of your programming, the way in which it is put together, because you want to effectively work within the parameters of what we know about these pathways so that they don't interfere with each other as much as they otherwise could. So for example, if you went on a list run and then went into a hypertrophy focused session, AMPK would still be beyond baseline, which means that it would therefore interfere more with mTOR. And it's less so vice versa, isn't it? But it then comes down to sort of priority, skill degradation. There's a few other biomechanical things to consider. So I'll just jump in there. So there's a key takeaway for people, essentially, that the pathway context you're giving, this sets the scene for you to make decisions around the order in which you put your programming together.
Exactly that. And you said there's a number of different factors that can influence that, and we can discuss those. But ultimately, if you've got like a really intense particular session that you want to derive a lot of hypertrophy from, just try and keep your endurance training away from that, so we can avoid any interference effect, even if there is an interference effect. And in terms of session order, like you said, you want the session which is going to derive the biggest adaptation. And if your goal is hypertrophy, then that should come first. So that should always come before your endurance training. If you have the option to try and have it as far away as possible, either the next day or that evening, then even better. And even if you do end up combining it, say there is an interference effect, but it's not going to blunt it, it's not going to shut it off. In this case, you're probably just going to, if there's an interference effect, it just might reduce it. So your progress might be slower. But when you start to combine loads of things together, I think fatigue is more the issue here, rather than any molecular issue, especially long term.
So blanket rules for people to consider within the context you've just given is 3 hours for AMPK to generally return to baseline, which means that if you had a really busy day and wanted to cram things together, and you had to do some running first thing in the morning before you're lifting, then you'd want to leave a gap of 3 hours. However, the thing that often gets chucked around online, and I've seen in comments and YouTube videos most frequently, comes from a study on the interference effect previously, which suggests that you should leave 6 hours between sessions on double days. Do you want to just give a bit more context as to when that is the case and when that isn't the case? Because I've noticed a lot of confusion between the ordering of that 6 hour relationship, and a lot of people have confused it with the inverse. So essentially, if you're doing endurance training first thing in the morning, you should leave 6 hours before weight training. Johnny, I'll speak on his behalf, 6 hours is a good ballpark minimum to aim for. However, the other way around, the interference isn't quite as obvious because mTOR isn't, the sort of interference between the two isn't quite as intense. Am I right in saying?
Yeah. Shall we start with, if we use the 6 hour rule as the base?
Yeah.
So say we've got an endurance session in the morning and then weight training in the afternoon, as an example. I mean, the less you want that endurance training session to affect your later resistance training session, I would probably just make it like an easier run. Because of that, you're likely not going to get such a fatigue effect on the fast twitch fibers, which you'll probably need in the session later on in the day. And you've also got 6 hours to try and replenish any glycogen that you've used up in that session anyway. And hopefully by that time, if it's not like full intense interval session, like a real key endurance session, then likely the hood, especially if you're quite well trained, the amount of fatigue might have, decreased considerably by the time that second session occurs. If it was switched the other way around, which I'm always a big advocate for, because I like doing my strength sessions early, and likely is because that's probably when my fast twitch fibers are going to be more fresh. I want to try and utilize that. That means if I had it early in the day, any fatigue that might have been disrupted by any of the other sessions is probably going to be reduced slightly because you're doing it first. And then in those situations, if there is any fatigue of the fast twitch fibers, or you've got any potential conflicting from a molecular standpoint, you'd like to think that at least 6 hours might be enough for that to avoid any type of interference effect. For most people, it kind of depends on the intensity that you do it at. And I did also think that, is it the molecular side affects more the hypertrophy of it, and then the strength side might affect the fatigue of it in terms of what might be causing this interference effect, because it's clearly multifactorial. But in those situations, you probably just make the best call. Like if it's a really intense strength session that requires loads going over 90%, all of those sort of things, which is really draining neuromuscularly, you might decide to give your session, at least 12 hours until you do it again, because you want your neuromuscular system to be ready so you can put as much intent into the next session as possible. If it's an easy session after it, maybe I think you might be able to get away with that. But certainly if you did like let's say a really intense strength session in the morning, and then you've got like a really intense interval session later on in the day, that session in the morning might start to influence how well you perform in that second session. So it's just about making a decision around where like those key sessions are, and trying to avoid any molecular crossover or any fatigue crossing over to affect your performance in those sessions, because you want to maximize their potential.
But it's also important to mention that if practicality means that you can't do that, it's not an on and an off switch. And I really wanted to flag the 6 hour rule, because the way I've seen it spoken about online, and the way I've almost seen it prefaced as an excuse or a reason to not train like this, is almost akin to no carbs after 6 p.m. rule, where it's been pulled from
the gremlins.
Yeah, the gremlins come out and steal your gains. Or make your gains around your belly, apparently, if you eat carbs past 6. It's this strange dependency to that figure I've seen. I've had people sort of come at me on Instagram Reels whenever I've explained the order of training and double training days and things. I've had people talk about the 6 hour thing in the same way that, in the same generalized way that no carbs after 6 almost applies, because you're like, okay, well, the behavioral patterns where the no carbs after 6 thing probably came from made sense. But the way it spiraled out of control to bros saying you can't have carbs after 6, otherwise you're going to get really fat, is the downstream effect of bro science, effectively, in the same way that I'm sure the research and literature, well, as it says in the study, the research and literature around the 6 hours of recovery between sessions is considering the multifactorial variables at play. But that doesn't then mean that, oh no, it's 6 hours, oh, it's 5 hours and 55 minutes since my last session, I can't start training yet. Oh, it's 6 hours and 1 minute. Okay, let's go. I've seen a bit of a narrative like that developing. That's something I'm just keen to tackle, because practicality, consistency, and execution trumps all when it comes to this variety of training. As long as you're doing key sessions executed with quality at the right intensity, not exceeding your maximum recoverable volume, there are lots of things to consider to mitigate the top end demand of the interference effect. But doing the sessions and doing the training and consistently developing and progressing over time is more important than these really top level considerations. And that's why occasionally I know that my upper body session feels like shit if I've swam in the morning, but sometimes I need to be at the office at 6 in the morning and therefore will swim at 5 in the morning, because it's the way that my day works. So rather than thinking, oh, I'll train at 7 p.m. and then go to the pool at 9 p.m. just for the sake of sticking to these rules, sometimes you need to consider within the context of your week and within the context of just executing the skill and accruing the volume, you need to almost do away with the black and white narrative that some corners of the internet are putting across when it comes to the interference effect. And I want to bring us back to the notion of hypertrophy here, because I think this is where people are so fearful of, oh, it's going to steal my gains, I'm going to lose my gains. But when it comes to mTOR, when it comes to protein synthesis, there's a whole other element of nutrition here, which I think I'll just quickly touch upon so that that's clear. But I know you hear the nutrition word and panic, Phil, because it's not your area of expertise, and I know how protective
you know
of
me well.
Your areas of expertise, scientists are. It's very much I'll stay confidently in my lane
role
and not step on anyone else's toes. But the way that we view things is there is an energy balance to balance the books of. So if you view your calories in, calories out as a P&L sheet, you essentially want to be breaking even at the very least, unless you're in a deficit to lose body fat. But when you implement endurance training, your calorie expenditure is going to go up. And the mistake most people make is that they don't account for that additional expenditure and therefore inadvertently put themselves in a deficit. So when going to maintenance and beyond into a surplus to build muscle and to provide the muscle's protein synthesis to sort of reap the rewards of mTOR being activated, you effectively need to account for the endurance training volume that's putting that general baseline higher. So nutrition, if you're into muscle building, I'd like to think, if you're listening, you've got enough of an understanding on how to build muscle from a generalized nutrition point of view in terms of surplus and the stimulus required. But when it comes to stacking endurance on top, the main consideration is accounting for the additional calorie expenditure within the context of your week, and then programming volume, programming order, and programming emphasis throughout the context of a week, sort of microcycle, mesocycle, and beyond. And I think that's where we'll focus just now, Phil, because there is nothing in terms of a sort of biochemistry, muscle tissue, everything going on, where the execution of aerobic work or anaerobic work is actively compromising gains. Is there? There is no way that gains are being stolen. It is the process and the patterns around the training simultaneously that can potentially make you lose weight. But that can come down to the nutrition. That can come back to inadequate volume. It can come back to the way that you've programmed, you've ordered your programming. So I want to make crystal clear that on premise, cardiovascular training does not make you weaker, does not eat your muscle. But what it can do is it can eat into potential training volume that week that could have been devoted to weight training. It eats into fatigue, which therefore potentially stops you from executing certain disciplines as well. And it can increase your calorie expenditure, which means that you might be fighting to eat at maintenance or beyond. So is there anything you want to flag from a research point of view, Phil, on the sort of general things I've just discussed there? Because I appreciate that's all quite conceptual, but I just really want to make clear that there are no gains goblins coming for your gremlins, rather, coming to sort of chew away at your muscle tissue whilst you're running on the treadmill. But the gains gremlins might appear if when running on the treadmill, you fail to account for the additional calorie expenditure that comes from it, or you don't do that full body session on Friday because you're tired from your run the night before, etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you're going to do a number of those factors that could lead to you being in a catabolic state, that's going to start to maybe reduce muscle size, but the contribution from endurance training really is quite small, or just one part of a very big jigsaw. Like like you said, if you're doing a load of endurance training, you're not getting the sufficient nutrition to support that and support the resistance training that you're also doing, and the addition of endurance training is then eating into the amount of time that you could be doing resistance training. Yeah, you're going to see completely different results. It isn't that endurance training is some kind of goblin that's coming to, I don't know, I need some resources. Oh, there's a muscle, I'll take that.
Chomp, chomp, chomp.
It's not that at all. And I always say the worst, usually the poorest form of recovery is a poorly programmed or poorly structured program.
Agreed. God, we could go off on a big tangent here. The functional fitness London community that just send it all week, every week, and wonder why they're battered, and then think that an ice plunge is going to solve the problem. I mean, there's lots of people I know in that community that don't do that, but it's the desire.
There's such a disconnect there, isn't it?
It's where sweat is the metric. That's where it becomes a problem. So I think I'm going to make a proposition, Phil. I think because we could sit here and chat about this till the cows come home, I instead propose that we play a game of tennis. And by that, I mean that I will serve and suggest a single top line point for people to consider on how they can build muscle and get fitter. And then you can return serve depending on what the score ends up. So cool. 0-0, Fergus to serve. And I'll start with what I've just summarized, which is that you must account for the additional energy expenditure from working in running, which means that your maintenance calorie intake, or the calorie intake that is required for you to be in a surplus and therefore to build muscle, will be higher, which means diligent tracking, which means getting used to your intake around certain training, manipulating your carb intake around when you feel best and things so that you're getting the best performance out of your nutrition. But don't fall into the trap of knowing that my maintenance has been X for this many years, or I eat roughly the same thing all day, every day, and then start running, because that will add additional demand, which you need to account for. Otherwise, you will be inadvertently gremlining your gains. So, okay, 15 love, Phil to serve.
My recommendation would be, if you're doing a particular session that is focused on developing hypertrophy, as in you are going to be, I don't know, let's say slightly higher volume, you're in that area of 60 to 70, 80 maybe percent of your 1RM or perceived 1RM, you're going to put a lot of time under tension on those muscles. You're probably going to get a situation where mTOR is elevated and for a longer period of time. So if you know you have a particular session that's going to do that, make sure that you try and organize the rest of your training week to maximize the recovery from that session. So that might be that you have a longer period before you train again, or certainly an even longer period before you start to do a very intense session, particularly if it's in endurance. I wouldn't worry too much about, the whole 6-hour rule. Like, it's an all right rule, but rules can be broken when there's so many factors you can play around with. So, if you've got a big session on Monday morning that's going to develop a lot of DOMs, say, make sure that your second session, if it's on that day, is a bit of an easier session, or maybe wait until the next day. Try and maximize, do a single session that day, play around with it.
Fantastic. Great shot, Phil. 15 all. So from an Omnia point of view, we generally, given that the bias for most of our athletes is fairly equal between strength and endurance training, as not a blanket rule, but as a majority rule, we would recommend prioritizing weight training on any double day that you have when the second discipline is endurance focused, or a triathlon skill for something like that. So if you're swimming, biking, running, rowing, hill walking, stair mastering, and you have a lifting session that day, we would recommend that you do the lifting session first, because, as we've mentioned, the relationship between mTOR and AMPK is more in line with the sort of research and literature around the interference effect. Secondly, the skill degradation that comes from more top-end strength movements, i.e. if you need to move your body in a certain way under load for 8 reps, the skill degradation is going to be far more severe than a 180 cadence with at body weight for 30 minutes. The repetitive strain of that is going to have significantly more of an effect on your ability to effectively execute your movement patterns in a squat or a deadlift, for example, if in the evening, because of the fatigue that is accounted for. So as a blanket rule, no. As a majority rule, unless somebody's goals are very triathlon or running specific and they're just doing strength training to support that, that is a slightly different argument. And that's not something we'll cover today, but I do want to caveat with that. We would always recommend on any double days that strength training is prioritized, unless that means that you cannot effectively do the 2 sessions in a day within the context of your schedule, and the rest of the programming week cannot be adjusted to account for that, in which case getting the volume in and accepting that you will be maybe nudging a little bit closer to the demands of the interference effect, and therefore maybe progressing 0.5% slower over the course of 6 months, then that is the case. So, wow, back right corner, you got murked, Phil, 30-15, nice.
As running is the example, I would potentially encourage the use of using a bike for some additional, for some of your aerobic work, your zone 2 work. The reason being is that the studies that have shown any type of interference effect, usually it doesn't actually happen if they've chosen cycling over running. Now, if you're a runner and that's your chosen endurance part of your endurance hybrid training, then you have to run. However, if you try and supplement it with some cycling, especially maybe in the off season, if there is an off season, it depends how you've structured your year, it's always a good opportunity to use that. You know, you're not getting the repetitive eccentric loading every step in cycling. You're off your feet technically. So, you know, take advantage of that, because you're going to have different levels of fatigue coming from cycling versus running. And you can potentially take advantage of that to add a bit more volume and not to become too fatigued that it affects all of your other training. And there's even, I need to go back and find it, but they've also found that almost using a concurrent training approach with using cycling has actually aided the hypertrophy of the quadriceps. That could be from improvement of dilation of particular capillaries, improved blood flow, and that's helped with developing, the transition of oxygen, which helps muscular contraction, which may lead to improvements in hypertrophy. There's something for that. So if you're a runner, and you want to improve your hypertrophy, you're probably a bit of a heavier hybrid athlete. So maybe having some cycling sessions as some of your easy sessions might be able to help control that fatigue that running gives you in a hybrid program.
Fantastic. 30 all. So this is free information from our overarching methodology, but to counteract a lot of the things that we flagged at Omnia, we peak intensity at the start of the week and peak volume at the end of the week. And that means that you can account for a lot of the pitfalls that we've referenced today within the context of that sort of microcycle, because the interference of high intensity training earlier in the week, that big Monday session that kills you, as Phil's already referenced, by the time you're going for your long voluminous session on the Saturday, on the Sunday, you'll be almost fully recovered from that demanding session on the Monday. So the interference across the spectrum of demand in terms of energy systems are sort of scattered across the week in a strategic way. And that means that you can essentially balance and almost use aerobic work as a form of recovery for your high intensity work. And in the same vein, you can use high intensity work as a form of recovery from your aerobic work through the sort of range of motion that you're working through the sort of blood flow and everything that's going on with higher volume strength work. But by focusing your high intensity work earlier in the week, it means that you're essentially getting that big spike of mTOR activation out of the way. And then the rest of the week, you're almost blunting the big response when it comes to that higher intensity work, which means that as the relationship between intensity and volume develops, you can understand more and more about how much you can tolerate from an intensity point of view and how much you can tolerate from a volume point of view, and where you adjust within the context of a week. So we would recommend, obviously, as it's kind of the premise of our methodology, that you would do the same. But if you would like that to be sketched out for you, then we have some fantastic products on the website that can help you do exactly that. So, wow, what a shot. 40-30, Phil.
We're going to juice, aren't we?
Yeah, I've just realised there's no way one of us can win without making 2 points.
Yeah, you should have done like tic-tac-toe or something.
We'll probably get to 40 all and then call it off because of bad light.
We're not going to wait for the roof to go over.
No. This is a budget leisure centre, I'm afraid.
My final recommendation would be around how, in terms of hypertrophy, it's probably going to be less affected in the upper body, which kind of makes sense. If you're doing cycling or running, the predominant muscles that are going to be working there, quads, hamstrings, your gastroc, soleus, all of that type of thing. So they're the ones that are actually working. So they're probably the ones that have the increase in mTOR, all of the things that we've kind of talked about, fatigue, all of that. You get that less in the upper body because it's not working unless you're running on your hands. So, you might want to take that into account, because you could probably get away from a fatigue standpoint by doing some extra additional upper body work, which, you're not going to have too much of a net negative impact by adding it. If you added in like a load of extra squats or something like that, you might do, because the body can't take that total amount of work. Whereas you could probably get away with it with the upper body. Now, with that, it might increase your body weight, because it's saying that you're hypertrophying at such a massive rate, just gets suddenly huge that you become heavier. That's obviously going to affect your running. It's something to consider. But in terms of any interference effect that might occur, it's likely going to occur more in a muscle that's predominantly used for your endurance exercise. So upper body work and probably get away with a bit more.
Good examples, Nick, there, who for most of his work over the past couple of years has done almost no lower body training whilst he's been doing his big events, which is sort of a key difference between his hybrid approach and our hybrid approach, whereby we sort of train everything year round, but just sort of turn the dials up and down, because it means that there's less of a rebuild and less of a sort of recovery phase from one of the components that you work in regularly. But yeah, upper body volume that you can sort of see on his YouTube, there's very little squatting and deadlifting going on when he was peak marathon prep, for example. We're not huge fans of that approach, because it means that it depends on your goals. If you're wanting to be strong and have a great marathon, then you want to keep squatting and deadlifting if you want to keep having a decent squat and deadlift. But if you want to say within the context of a year you ran a really fast marathon and had a great deadlift, then you can also do it that way. But we're just more of a fan of the in omnia paritas approach, obviously, because prepared for all things is kind of an all-encompassing existence. It's a lifestyle, man, rather than one where you completely abandon things for the sake of something else. Because this is where we have a lot of clients come to us that say, I used to be a rugby player, went to the gym a lot, did an Ironman, had a coach for my Ironman, really focused in, didn't do any strength training, went back to the gym because that's what I really enjoy, and I'm weak as piss and don't enjoy the gym anymore. What can I do? So we are huge fans of basically essentially micro-dosing all of the things that you would like to be doing on a regular basis, and then turning up the dials on the specificity as and when it becomes relevant. And I'm just going to ignore the rules of tennis here and make a sneaky little last point to make it
drop shot.
Drop shot, where it was so good that I didn't need to win by 2 clear points. But essentially, the eccentric loading of tempo training, hypertrophy training, bodybuilding style training will mean more DOMs, will mean more fatigue in tendons, will mean more obvious proprioceptive fatigue. So that's why the intensity and volume curve works even more effectively here, because it means that when you're feeling most fatigued, you won't need to be worrying too much about the key sessions from an endurance point of view in terms of the DOMs and the tendon demand and all that stuff. And with strength work, you can get away with a lot less eccentric loading. Olympic lifting, much less eccentric loading, whereas bodybuilding focus is actually making use of it and utilizing it much more. And that does accrue a lot more fatigue. So essentially, just be conscious of the fact that if you're doing tempo work, if you're doing really controlled mind muscle connection focused movements, that's going to accrue more fatigue than a standard strength program would. And therefore, that will carry over to your running, and you should program accordingly. But I think that's pretty much it, unless you've got anything else to add, Phil.
No, it's a really good point, because DOMS has shown to increase the oxygen cost of your subsequent training session.
By how much? Is there a figure we can attach to that?
I don't know by a percentage, but it affects the particular parts of the nervous system which affects ventilation, and therefore will affect oxygen costs. So if you've got a load of DOMS and then you do like I don't know, like an easy run or something like that, it's likely going to be a high oxygen cost to maintain a certain speed. So, that's something to consider. That's not me saying don't do the endurance session, but it's, a higher oxygen cost is probably going to result in greater training stress. And then, what does that do further down in the program? So
fantastic. Cool. Well, I hope that has been informative, everyone. Oh, said that very strangely. I hope that has been informative, everyone. Wow, that was much better. As it's a very hotly debated topic. That's the second time we've sort of covered it in slightly different detail. So if you haven't yet listened to our previous episode with James Blanchard, please do, as we focus on it from a more anecdotal and experiential point of view. But that is a top-line summary of the energy pathways that underpin what we're discussing, and a game of tennis. So there you are. Bet you didn't see that coming on this... When's this coming out? Friday, but you could be listening to it any time. So at this point, I'm just going to stop talking and say thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.